This is the Know Your Law series by Barefoot Law, a non-profit organization which uses digital innovation and technology to provide free legal information and guidance for all. For more information, visit www.barefootlaw.org.
An official welcome to our panelists. I'd like to welcome each one of you individually and then have you introduce yourselves. But before that, I'm just going to introduce what our webinar is about, just for those who may want a little more context. So today's topic, what we're speaking about is gender-based violence. And what we want to touch on specifically is how we can craft a legal response to gender-based violence, such that if you are a victim or if you know someone that's a victim, which was probably going to happen to each one of us in our lifetimes, according to the really poor statistics that, not poor, but like the terrible statistics of how much gender-based violence there is, not just in Uganda, but globally. This means what we need to do is to all be prepared to either be armed with the tools that we need to understand how to respond if this happens to you, but also to have the tools that you need in case you are the person that's reached out to by a victim, or if you know someone who is looking for a response from the law or who's trying to find some resolve to a situation like this. So that is what we are hoping that we conclude this webinar with. My name is Phoebe Murungi, and I am the Director of Legal Services at Barefoot Law. Barefoot Law is a non-profit organization which uses technology and other forms of innovation to provide free legal information to the public. So what our belief is that before you even step into, for instance, a courtroom, one of the things that is primary is for you to understand what your rights are, to understand what your options are in terms of a legal response, to understand where you can go to receive help. And that is what we do at Barefoot Law. We just arm you with the tools and the information that you need in order to use the law to provide, to find a justice and to find resolve to your justice needs.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. Hello, everyone. My name is Penina Susan Igaga, and I'm a legal officer at Barefoot Law. I'm also head of a caucus, basically caucus dealing with the beneficiaries who reach out to us, how we respond to them, how we deal with them, how we ensure that they are armed with, like Phoebe mentioned, the right law, and just to make sure that they are able to understand the law. I'm happy to be here, and I'm hoping for a very engaging conversation on gender-based violence. Thank you.
My name is Prima Kwagala. I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm also a director at the Women's Pro Bono Initiative. My day-to-day work involves providing access to justice for vulnerable women and girls that can't otherwise afford it. We provide psychosocial support, legal representation. We do lots of research and sharing what we find out in our research in various forums, especially in the area of sex, gender-based violence, which is portrayed in several forms in the media, online, in our day-to-day lives. And yeah, basically that I will be sharing a lot more as the discussion goes on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, and the entire team at Barefoot Law. My name is Jonathan Mwaganya. I am Chief State Attorney in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and I've been at this game for the last 13 years in this office. We basically do criminal litigation and with a lot to do with directing police in their investigations for any matter of a criminal nature, as per our mandate under Article 120 of the Constitution. I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion on this noble topic.
Amazing. Thank you, Jonathan. 13 years is definitely going to give us enough information to poke at. Incidentally, every time we have a conversation, a sort of panel, and there's someone who's related to the state that's present, they just get a ton of questions. So I know you're going to be in that unique position of 12 of the questions are for you, and then 2 of them we split among the rest of us. Looking forward to the conversation, Jonathan.
My name is Tina Musuya. I'm a very proud feminist, and I work with Center for Domestic Violence Prevention, and I've been doing this work for many, many years. So what we do is working with the entire communities to change social norms and behaviors that perpetuate violence, taking communities through a process of change so that they create an enabling environment that values men and women equally, both in private and public space. That's one area. And then we do work with the institutions that respond to violence to create gender sensitive and responsive survivor-centered services that actually address the needs, especially prioritize the safety and needs of the survivor and holds perpetrators accountable. That's extremely important in this area. And then at the national level, we do advocacy for law reform and law implementation. As you can see, gender-based violence is a very complex phenomenon. The laws have to be really specific to those issues, and they have to address issue by issue because, for example, intimate partner violence is differently addressed from FGM, even though they are all gender-based violence. That's what we do. Over to you, and we are part of the women's movement.
I'm going to just get started by sharing with you, with the members of the panel as well as the audience, some of the data that we pulled up to just show what GBV is looking like specifically in the season of the pandemic and the lockdowns that ensued thereafter. Some of the data that we've seen is pulled up from a lady named Rose Apondi of the Centers for Disease Control, who made a presentation at the 11th International AIDS Society Conference on HIV Sciences. That was last month, and her findings were related to sexual violence against women before and during the COVID lockdown. Obviously, this is a specific gender-based crime. It doesn't encompass all of them, but this is data that can be helpful and that we can extrapolate from to what the situation is looking like right now. So the data studied was from about 6 months before the lockdown, and then the data of the lockdown was up for about 6 months thereafter. So April 2020 to September 2020. 22,000 women sought post-rape care, and this was 4,300 more than the pre-COVID-19 lockdown. That's 4,000 more women than the pre-COVID lockdown period. And this difference, just to give you some context, this difference is bigger than the number of students that some universities in Uganda have. So almost the size of an entire university's female population was seeking post-rape care during the lockdown. That is an insane statistic, if you ask me. And to think that we were going through a period where obviously there was a limitation on how you can seek certain social services, simply because movement was restricted and certain institutions were locked down or were working at minimum capacity. This just meant that an already dire situation in terms of access to justice became even more complicated. That is simply my take, just based on the statistics. But what we're here to discuss today is, what does the gender-based violence seen in Uganda look like? How can we respond to it legally? And we are also specifically giving due attention to the fact that we are dealing with a season of a pandemic. And we're discussing also how does an already tough situation of access to justice for victims of gender-based violence, how does that even become more complicated when we're dealing with a scenario really that no one has been prepared for worldwide? Yeah, so there's far more statistics, but I will maybe throw in a few here and there, and I'd encourage the panelists as well, if you have any sort of statistical information or anecdotal information that could help the audience kind of understand what gender-based violence, tackling gender-based violence, what it looks like. I already saw some information coming from Tina. Tina, we're very excited to have you on board as well. And it's interesting to hear that what your organization is doing is more of a holistic approach to gender-based violence. So that's going to be of very much interest to the rest of the team who may be specifically looking at gender-based violence with a legal lens. So we'll be happy to hear from you. What are those other ways we can be looking at GBV? So I'll be referring to gender-based violence as gender-based violence, or GBV, just in short. So a heads up on that. And I think we're ready to get started. So again, my name is Phoebe, and a huge welcome to the audience, but an even bigger welcome and a token of gratitude to our esteemed panelists who have made the time to be here with us today. I will get right in. So I'll start with Tina. Could you walk us through what gender-based violence is, first of all, for those who may be wondering, oh, you mentioned FGM, you mentioned sexual crimes, you mentioned children-related offenses. What exactly is GBV? What does it cover, and how does it present itself? Yes, over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Phoebe. And sorry, colleagues, I'll not switch on my video because my connection is not too great. I would rather you listen to my voice. So when it comes to what gender-based violence means, I would like to really stress that it's an umbrella term as defined by the United Nations. It's any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological harm or suffering to mostly women, whether it's occurring in the public or private life. And that means that all these forms of violations and abuse are overwhelmingly perpetrated, mainly by men, against women. And they are reinforced by structural inequalities. And these structural inequalities refer to systems of oppression in society. It's a gendered phenomenon that privileges men over women. You know, when you look back into our value system, men and women are not valued equally. So there are certain privileges that are defined for men, keeping them on top of everything and keeping women at a subordinate position, whether in private, marriage, in institutions, in workplaces, and so on. Now that kind of phenomena brings about the gender inequality. I would like the audience to really understand where the definition of gender-based violence is coming from. And to better understand this, I will go deep for you to see the types or the different forms of gender-based violence that are happening across the globe and even amidst our own selves. It's not only something for the poor people or for the Black people. So when we come back to the types of gender-based violence, and that's why we need to know them so that we do not confuse the public or the people when we are speaking about a different form of violence. Amongst these is intimate partner violence that happens between people who are in an intimate relationship. And this is always based on power and control. It could have forms of physical violence where there's beating and all that physical harm, beating, strangulation, burning, kicking, and so on, as well as within intimate partner violence, there's emotional violence that has a lot of controlling behavior. It's beyond insults and humiliation. It's about controlling behavior whereby, for example, Phoebe, you have a partner who wants to decide who you associate with, whether you work or not, where you're going. You might, if I'm to translate in the local speak. Then there's the sexual violence within an intimate relationship, where there's coercion, forceful sex, and lack of consent. And there's also the economic violence within the intimate partner violence, where there is refusal to provide, for example, prohibition of a partner from engaging in income generating activities. You know, there's always like, omwami akugambye tokola sigare waka. And then they keep, you know, not being paid, or even what you earned, you cannot make decisions about it. We've had stories of how women dig in the rural setting and the man sells off all the produce, marry new wives and so on, stuff like that. And then when it also comes to the economic violence within an intimate setting, you'll find that oftentimes the women don't have property rights within that relationship. They do not have, their labor is used, but they do not own, or they are excluded from property ownership. So that's one component. I was elaborate about intimate partner violence because it's extremely common and extremely prevalent, and it appears in all those forms. Then there is rape and sexual violence by either partners, former partners, or non-partners. You know, rape is sex without consent, which could be forceful or through coercion. And it could happen in the public space or the private space. Then there's early and forced marriages. That is also another form of gender-based violence. In many communities, there's a belief that girls should be married off early. As soon as they menstruate at the age of 13, they are married off in the form of preventing spoilage so that the family earns bride price or something of that kind. Then there's sexual harassment. I believe that all the Ugandan women on this setting, in this space, we've been sexually harassed, you know, as you go to the taxis by border men, in the public space, you know, all that kind of sexual harassment in the classes where we go to, even in places of worship and at the workplace. Then there is dowry-related violence. You will find that in many communities where there's bride price, there's a lot of violence that is being perpetrated mostly against the woman. She does not make decisions about how much, and that the cows and whatever they bring are not given to the woman, but she's the one to suffer the brunt of being owned as a property wherever she's been married to. They call her Mali. Mali is, you know, income or whatever to the new place where she's gone, meaning she cannot own anything. If you're property, you can't own property, and you can't make decisions and all those other related things. Then there's genital mutilation, female genital mutilation, which involves acts of, you know, mutilating or harming the genitalia of a woman. When we talk about female genital mutilation, these acts are physically committed against the woman's sexual, the genitalia, either to enhance the so-called sexual pleasure for the men or to control the sexuality of a woman. In some communities, like for example, in Uganda, the Karamojong communities and Sabine community, they cut the clitoris, the labia minora, and, you know, scoop to reduce the sexual pleasure of a woman, and then to define that that is a rite of initiation, of passage from childhood to adulthood, and then you're ready for marriage. All these are quite harmful practices that happen to women in the name of tradition. And finally, there's the online violence. That could be a form that we may not be very familiar with, but there's a lot of online harassment which comes with body shaming, bullying, and belittling of women, and also trafficking in persons and sexual exploitation. So all that you have to remember is women and girls are often at risk of experiencing violence throughout their lives, whatever age, through old age, reflecting the devaluation of women's health, safety, and well-being across their life course. Over to you, Phoebe.
Wow, thank you so much, Tena. I thought I knew everything about GBV, but I'm also learning, so that's really incredible. The range for gender-based violence is clearly much wider than most of us assume. oftentimes we can't imagine that there's a range as wide as from someone that's shouting you down the road, which happens often, especially if you're a runner, which I am. Being out on the road is always some level of risk. And from that to the point of child marriage, to online violence, to intimate partner violence, to economic violence, there's so many layers to this that I can't even imagine that we in this session are going to be able to discuss all the forms. But it's a great start that we understand how wide this is, and that we can continue to remember that there's a power element, which Tina has emphasized, which is that in structures that are built to hold one gender as superior to the other, it lays a lot of groundwork for the actual violence being perpetrated, because after that, it makes it a lot easier to actually get to the crime itself being committed. So now move us from the general understanding to understanding what the Ugandan law provides as remedy or as protection for a possible victim. So I will go over to you, Ms. Penny. Could you tell us what is the level of protection that victims of gender-based violence have under Ugandan law? What are the different layers? What are the different, what's the recourse that they have when they are faced with a situation of as the many kinds of scenarios that Tina has very ably laid out?
Thank you very much, Phoebe and Tina, for that very elaborate emphasis on what exactly gender-based violence is. Just as a fact, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, globally, 243 million women and girls were abused. You know, there was some sort of gender-based violence that was that they were really exposed to. So now imagine a situation where we have the COVID-19 pandemic and people are just at home with no recourse, they have no avenue. So it has been really, it's been quite a situation during this COVID-19 pandemic period. Now, my main emphasis is going to be on the level of protection that survivors, I prefer to call them survivors as opposed to victims, of GBV have under the Ugandan law, the different levels of protection that they should have ideally. Now, to begin with, as a country, Uganda ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the acronym being CEDAW, or CEDAW, whatever way you may wish to pronounce it. And from there on, we see that the Ugandan Constitution under Article 33 emphasizes the need for full and equal dignity of the person with men, and also prohibits any laws, cultures, customs, or any sort of tradition that may undermine the welfare and the dignity or status of a woman. Yes. Now, these laws are those that protect the woman, or gender, based on things like land ownership, marital customs, child custody norms. And where we have situations that are against these laws, they are or should be considered a point of concern when you're in a community where these laws are in place, but they are not being followed in any way. Now, violence against women is on the increase in Uganda, despite the presence of the laws that I'm going to try and bring out. Tina gave a very exhaustive list of forms of gender-based violence. We have the economic, we have the type of violence that would happen at home, the one that will happen in school, that will happen everywhere. So the laws that I'm going to give are more of the general laws. I may not go into emphasis. I may not emphasize each particular violence and then what law applies to it. But then we have like I mentioned, there's the Constitution, which is the the mother law. And then we have the Domestic Violence Act. Yes, the Domestic Violence Act of 2010. It was a bill for quite a long time, but eventually in 2010 was made an act. And where I'm also going to talk about the level of protection that it has, and as an individual where I would feel more has to be done, is that this particular law does not cover cohabiting couples. A lot of people who live within Uganda have a come with stay system. So we have the Domestic Violence Act that is supposed to protect the women, the women who are in these homes, but we find that it does not cover cohabiting spouses. So that is something that may have to be looked into when it comes to the protection of the people this law is supposed to be protecting. We have the Penal Code Act, the Penal Code Act, the Penal Code Amendment Act of 2007. That is meant to also protect the women in situations like some of those that Tina mentioned, where they are being harassed or their rights are being trampled on. One of my main issues with that one would be the fact that marital rape is not considered, it's not considered an offense yet, if I can put it that way, because it is assumed that once you get married, you have actually given consent to everything that is involved with marriage. So that level of protection has to be looked into. Is this law really protecting the women that the law was set to protect? Then we have the Employment Act, the Employment Act of 2006. That is meant to protect the women who are within the workplace. Yes. Now, I would question also at some point the level of protection where it restricts punitive action in sexual harassment cases at work when it comes to an employer. So you would ask yourself, what about her male colleagues or the colleagues that she works with? This particular law emphasizes employer-employee relationships. Yes, so when it comes to the level of protection of these victims, there are government institutions that are expected that have the mandate to respond to GBV once reported. And one of the main arms is the Uganda Police. Yes, we have the Uganda Police has a gender-based violence call center that ideally we are supposed to call into when we have an issue. And once I spoke to our area police, when I was talking to our area police, she said that usually when that call is made, area police is dispatched to the particular home. Yeah, so they go to that particular home and try and find what exactly happens. I'm hoping that is what really happens. Now, in 1986, a gender desk was created in the Uganda Police that was supposed to help out when it came to gender issues. And that eventually became the Child and Family Protection Unit, because a lot of the times when there is GBV, the women also get affected. So there's that. And then we have the local council courts. Usually a complaint of GBV is made and can be made to a local council court where the victim or the perpetrator resides. So that can be an avenue where a survivor can get some kind of assistance when it comes to their particular issue. Judicial services are very important when it comes to the fight against GBV. For judicial, one thing that really has to be emphasized when it comes to the judicial services and whatever assistance they are supposed to give to the survivors is that while judicial officers are working with GBV survivors, it is important that a training is had, periodically. And this training should include, at a minimum, how to ensure providing services through a survivor-centered approach. Yeah. And a survivor-centered approach is more about how putting yourself in to this person's shoes while ensuring adherence to the principle of, it's called the principle of do not harm. So many times as we are helping the survivors, we may think that we are helping them the best we can, but is it harming them in any way? Yeah. As a lawyer, our default setting is that we have to get to the root of the issue and find out what exactly this person wants. And usually it's more of what comes straight to you naturally is legal. But when you, as a judicial officer or, you know, anyone in the legal system, we need to embrace the survivor-centered approach and ensure the principle of do not harm. So those are some of the government institutions that I believe are mandated to respond to GBV once they are reported. And yeah, the level of protection when it comes to these victims under GBV are some of the things that have to continue being discussed, because yes, we may have the laws, Phoebe, but how these laws are supposed to be used given whatever situation or circumstance happens should be tailor-made, in that what applies to one woman may not actually apply to another woman. We may have a general law, but how do we come up with a middle ground to make sure that every woman who's suffering from GBV, every person who's suffering from GBV is actually helped? Yes.
Oh, amazing, Penny. Thanks again. I feel like I'm learning more than the audience is learning, because a lot of these things were concepts in my mind, and now they're forming a clear picture of what the response system looks like. And I am happy to learn that there's a call center, a Uganda Police Force call center for related specifically to domestic violence. Maybe what we'll do is try to call one. See if anyone's picking up, but that would be truly incredible, because I do think aside from just dialing 999 to report an ordinary crime, I think calling a specific team that has some training in how to respond to gender-based violence is a very unique measure.